What we're going to talk about now is we're going to talk about soil structure. Okay, so soil texture is the size of the individual particles in a soil. Soil structure, on the other hand, is how those individual particles stick together and clump together to form what we call aggregates or clumps. So this thing here is an aggregate or a clump of soil. It's millions of different soil particles that are stuck together through things like organic matter. Iron oxide sticks particles together, calcium ions stick soil particles together, but lots of different things are going to stick soil particles together. And so when we get these clumps, okay, those clumps are called aggregates, and that's all part of soil structure. So soil structure is the arrangement of soil particles in the soil. Now there's different shapes and different sizes of soil structure. If we look over here on my right, okay, a lot of this is what we call single grain structure. There's really no clumps. Okay, so it's and any clumps that are there are very weak. They fall apart really easily. Okay, so this is a bunch of sand. Sand doesn't form good aggregates, and you can see that when you go to the beach. When you go to the beach and start and get in the sand is really loose and doesn't stick together in clumps. That's called single grain structure, and it's common in sands. Now, even our sandy agricultural soils will have single grain structure. Matter of fact, this soil here came from a field which is very sandy. Okay? Now, this shape of aggregate is called a granular aggregate. That's the shape. We call it granular. It's round. Okay? So granular aggregates are round, and they come in various sizes. Now, sometimes granular aggregates stick together really well. For example, this one over here, this is a granular aggregate, and I can squeeze it really hard, and it won't fall apart. Okay, so it's what we call a stable aggregate. This aggregate, on the other hand, is about the same size, but if I squeeze it, it will fall apart fairly easily, and of course it's not this time, but that's okay. But that's because it's really dry. But when it gets wet, this aggregate will fall apart very easily. This aggregate will not. Okay? Now, the biggest difference between these two soils is that the one on my left, your right, it has more organic matter in it than the one in the middle. Okay? The organic matter is acting like a glue to stick the soil particles together into these aggregates. So we wind up getting what's called a stable aggregate. When these aggregates, these dark colored aggregates get wet, they won't fall apart. When these aggregates in the middle get wet, they will fall apart, and what will happen then is when the soil dries out again, these will form a very hard layer on the surface, which we call a crust. And that's something we want to avoid. Okay, so a crust is something that will prevent plants from emerging after they germinate and start growing. The plants will have trouble emerging from the soil, and that reduces the stand of plants. In agriculture, that's an issue because we get fewer plants, so that often means lower yields. In the broader environment, that's an issue because Mother Nature has a way of making sure that there's enough ground cover, and if the plants are prevented from emerging from the soil, we don't get the proper ground cover, so that exposes the soil to things like erosion and other problems. Okay, so soil structure is the clumping together of soil particles into aggregates. Okay, and the aggregates that I've shown you right now are granular, what we call granular aggregates, or over here single grain, which aren't aggregates at all. Now, there's other shapes of aggregates we have as well, which I don't have, couldn't find any to show you, but there is something called a columnar structure. Columnar structure are large columns. They can be this big around. They can be 10 centimeters, even 15 centimeters across, and they're shaped like columns, just like a tree trunk, and all packed together. Related to that, we can have prismatic structure. Prismatic structure are three-sided. They're shaped like prisms, similar to columnar structure, but they have sharp corners instead of being round like columns. We can also have something called Platy Structure. Platy Structure is something we find in forests. And what happens is, when a soil freezes, it freezes with a layer of soil and a layer of water and a layer of soil and a layer of water. And that layering that happens when a soil freezes creates aggregates that are very thin and shaped like pieces of paper. And so that's called Platy Structure. Not common in agricultural fields because usually destroyed by tillage, but they were really common in woodlots and forests. That's where we find them, in soils in Ontario. Okay, so that's just a little bit about soil structure. Okay, important property because it changes porosity, it changes water holding capacity. Structure also changes how water moves through the soil as well. The drainage affects the drainage of a soil. So there's lots of properties that are affected by the soil structure. One of the things that people often think about when they're thinking about soils is they think of earthworms. Okay, earthworms, normally we think that they're good. We see them in our garden. We get them out of the garden and you go fishing with them or whatever. So very often earthworms are considered to be a benefit. Now, earthworms in Ontario and Canada in general are invasive. Okay, they weren't here. So 15,000 years ago when the glaciers left, we didn't have any earthworms in Ontario. Okay, they are an invasive species. They came over with the Europeans, and they came in ship's ballast and in root balls of trees and plants they were bringing over to establish their farms. And so they've been really, really successful. In agriculture, earthworms are considered to be good because they produce large pores for drainage, so they allow fields to drain out more easily and dry out faster in the spring, and release nutrients. The earthworms will eat organic materials, release nutrients, and produce beneficial bacteria for the soil. So in agricultural areas, earthworms we consider to be beneficial. However, when you think about the natural areas of Ontario and North America in general, those natural areas developed without earthworms. And so the ecosystem developed without earthworms as part of that ecosystem. And as a result, so what's happened is that the ecosystem is built up without earthworms. So when we look at the forest floor, the layer of organic material that's built up on the forest floor, and all the organisms that live in that organic matter, that all developed in the absence of worms. Now, when worms move into an area, what happens is they eat they eat the organic materials that fall to the surface of the soil. So the leaves and twigs and all that stuff in the forest that fall to the surface normally would build up. But when earthworms move in, they eat that material. They literally will scavenge all the organic matter they can, and they'll leave a bare soil surface. So any organism that actually relied on that ground cover for survival, they've lost their homes. They've lost their food. And so earthworms are considered to be detrimental to our natural ecosystems in Ontario, simply because they eat up all the organic matter and take away the homes of all those organisms that relied on that layer of organic matter on the surface of a forest. We have good things and bad things, just like everything else in the world. Sometimes earthworms are beneficial for us, but many times they aren't so beneficial. And very often we've ignored the detrimental effects that earthworms have had on our environment.